Good afternoon. I'm Provost and Executive Vice Chancellor Ralph Hexter, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the second event in the 2017-18 season of the UC Davis Forums on the Public University and the Social Good. For anyone who might be unfamiliar with this lecture series, the UC Davis Forums was established in 2012 and presents about a half dozen lectures each academic year by experts from a broad range of fields. The series was designed to promote informed and thoughtful dialogue among members of the community and the public about the serious challenges facing public universities today, ways of responding to those challenges, and how the public university is evolving as an institution, with an ultimate goal of helping to produce a public university that will best serve society and individuals. This series poses the question, what should and can the public university be in the 21st century? Our first event this season got us off to a strong start. It featured UCLA professor Sylvia Hurtado, who addressed campus climate and diversity with respect to STEM disciplines and how we might better address disparities and boost success for underrepresented students. Today's forum promises to be equally exciting and set a high bar, though it will come at the public university from a very different angle. Professor Michael Storper and Associate Vice Chancellor Mary Walshok will focus in large part on how universities have affected the development of 3 California regions. I know we're all eager to hear the conclusions of their research and analysis, but before our moderator formally introduces our speakers, I do have a few thank yous and announcements. I'd like to first thank all of who made this event possible. First and foremost, Professor Storper and Associate Vice Chancellor Walshok for generously agreeing to be with us today and share their knowledge and insights. Next, the UC Davis Forums Steering Committee, led by Martin Kenny, Professor of Human and Community Development. I thank Professor Kenny also for serving as moderator of today's event. Finally, I want to acknowledge the campus units that have joined my office to sponsor this lecture: the Community and Regional Development Program, the Center for Regional Change, the Graduate Group in Geography. Looking ahead, I encourage everyone here to attend as many of our upcoming forums as your schedule permits. The next one, which will be held on February 15th, will feature feminist scholar and writer Sarah Ahmed speaking on the timely topic, Complaint, Diversity Work, Feminism, and Institutions. For information on this and all our season's forums, as well as access to our video archive of past events, please visit the series website at forums.ucdavis.edu. One more announcement. After today's presentation, there will be a question and answer period and a reception just outside this room. I hope you'll stay and speak with one another and our visiting speakers, and of course for the refreshments. And now, I very happily yield the podium to Professor Kenny.
Thank you, Provost Hexter. Today we're privileged to have, in alphabetical order, Michael Storper, a distinguished professor at UCLA's Luskin School of Public Affairs and a professor at the London School of Economics, and Mary Walshok, the Associate Vice Chancellor for Public Programs, Dean of Extension, Professor of Sociology, and many other titles to speak with us. Quite frankly, the accomplishments of both Mary and Michael are so many that just describing them would take up all of the time. Today, they will be speaking about their recent books and research on California's great metropolitan regions, Los Angeles, San Diego, and San Francisco, and the role of knowledge and universities in their growth. Michael is one of the, if not most well-known economic geographers of his generation, certainly in the leading ranks, and an astute observer of the growth and change of cities. He is the author of numerous books and academic articles across the social science disciplines. I first met Michael and became acutely aware of his importance as an academic leader at an École de Régulation conference in Barcelona in 1988, a few years ago. And I've followed his work avidly since then. His book with Richard Walker, The Capitalist Imperative, Territory, Technology, and Industrial Growth, remains a classic for understanding the effects of technology and industrial growth on place. Both he and I have had an abiding interest in the growth of California's great cities. When he and his co-authors came to me as the academic editor of a Stanford University Press book series with the manuscript for The Rise and Fall of Urban Economies, Lessons for San Francisco and Los Angeles, I was eager to include it in my series. Today, Michael will discuss some of the results reported in the book and what some of the lessons might be for public universities. Mary Walshok is a scholar, a community leader, and an administrator at UCSD. I've known Mary for 2 decades, both of us loving San Diego, and have been astonished by her ability to be a remarkably successful administrator of a large university extension program while continuing her scholarly pursuits. She was a key force in the absolutely fabulously successful UCSD Connect program, now just called Connect, that was instrumental in catalyzing high technology growth around UCSD. Even while she continues as an associate vice chancellor, she has been a powerful voice for engagement and inclusion in San Diego, nationally, and indeed globally. But there's more. She has continued as a scholar and researcher contributing to the academic community. As was the case with Michael's book, when she came to me with a manuscript entitled Invention and Reinvention of the Evolution of San Diego's Innovation Economy, I was delighted and jumped on it. And we published that. She chronicles San Diego's transformation from a rather sleepy place that I knew as a child into a knowledge economy, and how a public university, UCSD, had a central role in that transformation. We are so privileged to have these unique and exciting scholars here to speak in the UC Davis forums on the public university and the social good. So the plan is that Michael will speak for 30 minutes, then Mary will immediately follow and speak for 30 minutes, and then we will open the floor for 30 minutes to discussions and questions. And with that, I yield the podium to Michael.
Thank you for those introductions and for the opportunity to be here and dialogue with you and present some of the issues that we've been trying to think about in studying our California metropolitan areas. And of course to our great book series editor at Stanford, Martin. All right, so this cover is a result of a long research project that I did with 3 now former PhD students who are now doctors and working. And we became a team, and we took a long time, and they became my co-authors, which I'm very, very grateful for. Oops, let's see now. Let's see. Anybody know how to do this? That's the technical question.
Unfortunately, that computer is back in the back room. It's supposed to be, should be working.
Wait a minute. Wait, Martin, I might have a solution.
Yes,
I do.
you found
Okay.
it.
Yes, that was me.
Be sure to
Okay.
show it to me too.
All right, so I'm gonna come around to the subject of universities as part of a bigger puzzle of the development pathways of metropolitan regions, okay? But first we need to I need to kind of give you an overview of just how differently our 2 biggest metropolitan regions in California entered the new economy. So what this slide shows you is 1970 to the new millennium, and it's giving you what is a kind of a key way you can summarize how well a metropolitan economy or any economy is doing, which is per capita personal income. All right, this is kind of, basically it's an indicator of how wealthy a metropolitan region is. And the takeaway from this slide is that in 1970, when, oh, I should, okay, that's okay. I forgot you're recording. Just go ahead and stick it. Okay. That in 1970, which is which you might consider pre-new economy, okay? The new economy really is something that gets invented in the 1970s. It has to do with the technological revolution, right? The digital revolution. Basically, that comes about in 1971, 1972. And the following decades are the working out of this revolution through the economy as a whole. What you see here is that our two cases here, the Los Angeles Consolidated Statistical Area, for definitional purposes, that means 5 greater LA counties with a population of about 18 million people. The Bay Area at that time was 10 counties with a little bit short of 8 million people. Today it would be 12 counties. It got expanded by the government in definition because of all those commuters from Tracy and Stockton. But what you see here is these economies are, for all intents and purposes, virtually identical in their economic performance at the beginning of the new economy. They're about a third different in the recent period. That's a huge gap in favor of San Francisco. Basically, the San Francisco Bay Area becomes, on average, a lot wealthier than greater LA. In this second chart, you see a broader perspective, because there's something else you have to kind of put into this puzzle to think about. Listed there in the first column are the top 10 American metropolitan regions in terms of per capita income in 1970. That's the star group. And then you see them several decades later. So from the standpoint of us here in California, you see the Bay Area, number one, all right? Wealthiest metropolitan area in America. LA, in the very top elite group in 1970, number 4, falls out of the elite group by 2009. It slips 21 ranks. That's a lot. Look at a few other cases there. Say Cleveland, old industrial city, relatively wealthy in 1970, number 36 in 2009. Detroit, number 6 to number 52. All right, so the first point here is, as a background, when revolutions in the economy occur, they don't affect all places equally. And where you are in one phase of economic development is not a ticket, not an automatic ticket to staying in that same place as change occurs. There are things that affect whether some places make it from one period to another or whether they do poorly, okay? The other thing to interact here is that it's not just income, but we might say the attractivity or attractiveness of places in terms of people. There's a widely varying rates of population change. So the Bay Area and San Francisco are not all that different. The Bay Area has 78% population growth, LA has 55%. Those are both just slightly above the national median. But you see other cases, so New York does pretty well on income, but it's not really growing a lot. So what it's really doing is it's sustaining incomes over a relatively stable population, growing a lot less than the country as a whole. Seattle does well, moves up the ranks of income, 8 to 6, and doubles its population. All right? So you've got to think about quality of opportunity and quantity of opportunity. Here, of course, Detroit is a particularly depressing case, or so is Cleveland, because they're both slipping in terms of the quality of development, but they're actually, well, Detroit is barely holding its own at a metropolitan level. The city basically empties out, and Cleveland's actually losing people, right? So think about these as combinations of how economies can do. And there, all I've done is graphed them. The size of the circle is, it indicates the relative size of the metropolitan area. You see high population growth on the right side, all right? And high income growth on the top. So there, our comparison is instructive. The population growth isn't that different. What you can zero in on in comparing LA and San Francisco is that the quality of San Francisco's growth is better in terms of income. Both are pulling in a lot of people, but the kinds of opportunities they're extending are different. On average, they are higher wage qualities of opportunity than in LA. Now, it's not just because the Bay Area is some unusual outliner. When we started to do this research in Southern California, you can imagine people are a little bit defensive. When you present these kind of numbers, nobody wants to be told that they're not doing well. And the regional leaders would say, oh yeah, but it's unfair. You're comparing us to the most spectacularly successful city on the planet. How can you do that to us? But actually, LA did worse on income and innovation than New York, Houston, Chicago, Boston, Washington, Seattle, and a whole host of other cities. San Francisco is the most spectacular success story, but LA is not being, I think, treated unfairly here. It's also not because LA is expensive. It's because Southern California incomes haven't kept up, and that's because its job base is no longer as good as those of other areas, even though, as I'll show in a minute, Southern California, for much of the 20th century, up to 1970, was a leading region for wage growth and for innovation. All right? So somehow, LA was a star performer for much of the 20th century, and then something changes its fate, whereas San Francisco seems to be on a long-term kind of upward arc of development. Now, some people say, is this all because of housing, right? That is, Bay Area housing is somewhat more expensive on average than that of LA, although both, compared to the country as a whole, are very high-cost metropolitan areas. But actually, no. When you correct any of these numbers for the cost of living, which is mostly housing, you come up with still very substantial per capita income differences in favor of people in the Bay Area. Is it because of inequality? That's another thing you could ask. For example, what if you imagine a world where average incomes are much better in the Bay Area, but most of those incomes are enjoyed only by people at the top? Turns out not to be the case. That's because the two regions are equally unequal. And let me give you sort of a reference point there. The US as a whole, in this period we're examining, I think almost everybody in this room will be quite familiar with this, we've become a much more unequal country. Right? Our national income distribution has become very unequal, and we've had more inequality growth in the US than any other developed country. Within the US, there's a paradox, which is that the most highly performing metropolitan regions tend to be even more unequal than the country as a whole, probably because they have a lot of rich people. But in any case, in this comparison, what we call our Gini coefficients, that's the measure you do of it, they're identical. So what that means is that at any level in the economy, low, middle, or high income, the average person will be 20 to 30% better off in real terms than their counterpart in Southern California. That's pretty striking. Is it because LA is bigger? No. LA is bigger, by the way, but these are comparing commuting zones, which are integrated, functioning land, labor, and other economic markets. So when you look at the Bay Area and you look at the subregions, fully 75% of its population is in counties whose income per person is higher than the richest greater LA county, which is Orange County. So everyone in Southern California goes, you know, Orange County, right? Super rich suburban paradise, if that's the kind of thing you like. But it actually turns out that if you put Orange County in the Bay Area, it wouldn't be particularly highly performing. That really got people angry down there when I told them that. The other thing is that, as most of you may know, LA, like the Bay Area, has a big commuting zone from people who are inland, right? And some people thought, well, maybe that's bringing LA's figures down because you're adding in a lot of low-income people who are really not part of LA. That you correct for, so we actually captured only the people who were in the greater LA labor market, and we added them into the Bay Area. That's the Tracy and Stockton people that the government has now recognized are part of the Bay Area. So that's all to say that when you do these comparisons, you have to be careful, and I'm quite sure that my claim that LA is a poor performer in relationship to the Bay Area survives any test you can make of the numbers. Okay, so the basic story, right? Basic story is this. New economy comes along. The Bay Area is the center of it. It grows Silicon Valley. It refocuses its finance sector in a period when finance goes from boring banking to financial engineering. The Bay Area is not a big financial engineering sector, but what it has refocuses. It gets a growth of IT-related corporate headquarters. That's all the big firms that are household names today. And it's currently winning out in another major area of new economy, that's biotech. Contrast that to LA. It loses a lot of its technology base, which was concentrated in aerospace and defense. LA County was the biggest concentration of tech in the mid-20th century in America because it was where airplanes, missiles, communications systems and all that, and all the household names around aviation and guidance were, and many still are, in LA County. But it loses a lot of it, in part due to the end of the Cold War, and in part due to the mobilization of other regions in this country to get to the Pentagon, to get to the defense budget and pick pieces of LA's complex off and move them to their districts. We lose corporate headquarters, so LA is an outlier. It's the second biggest metropolitan area in America and almost non-existent as a corporate headquarters city, which is a typical part of any high-wage, big-time world city. It grows in light manufacturing, which is just a coded way of saying it grows in manufacturing with low wages. That's things like an apparel industry. The good news for LA is that the entertainment sector grows. Hollywood's a high-wage, high-skill part of the economy, but it's unlike its kind of media presence, it's actually not big enough to float the whole economy. It's relatively small. We gain in transportation and logistics. LA's leaders capture the China trade by doubling the size of its ports, but transportation and logistics are low-wage industries for the most part. It's trucking, warehousing, and those kinds of occupations. And we're currently losing out in biotech, in spite of having been one of the places where biotech was invented and initially innovated. So this gives you one key statistic, which is this. If you look at information technology sector in 1970, it was about 2.6% of the, what we call economic base employment of LA. Remember, that underestimates its importance because any core industry like that has what's called a multiplier. Generally speaking, in IT, it would be about, you'd multiply that by about 5 to get its direct effect on the economy. But San Francisco's figure was almost identical. We're talking about sort of pre-new economy, or just at the beginning of it. If you look at 2010, LA's is about the same, but San Francisco's is 4 times bigger. And that's the core story. It's the capture of all of these new economy sectors by San Francisco. And that translates to another key figure, which is, this is wages just in the core industries. These are the things, it's not dry cleaning and going to the supermarket and what we call the local or home market sector. It's the industries that we specialize in and that form our economic base. And the wages diverge in the same way that overall regional incomes do. So you can be almost sure that that's the cause of it. Now, alongside this isn't a perfect measure of innovation, but it's a decent kind of rough indicator, which is patents. LA and San Francisco, LA's actually kind of a better patenter earlier in the period, probably because it had a mature high-tech sector in defense and aerospace and all that. But with a new tech industry concentrated in the Bay Area, look what happens. The difference is spectacular. And that's true today as well, just to kind of give you an update, right?
in the recent period, the Bay Area's firms registered more than 60% of the entire state's patents in technology-based industries. And LA, remember, twice the size of the Bay Area, registers only about 21%. Right, so on a per capita basis, the Bay Area is way out front of LA. And San Diego, which is a fraction of the size of LA, Mary knows all about this, well outperformed LA County. LA County has 10 million people and was outperformed by a much smaller metropolitan region. So here's another piece of the puzzle. Advice for those of you who are going to work in these industries. If you want to be a computer programmer, go to the Bay Area, don't go to LA. And the reason is and these are pretty specific job categories. So you might think to yourself, or this is what economics tells us, is that two regions in the same country where people can move between regions should have roughly similar wages for the same work, unless there's some other wild card. But that's not true. Wages are much higher in the Bay Area for compared to similar occupations in LA. Now you might think, why aren't all these people moving there and either bringing the wages down in LA, or is it something about when they get to the Bay Area, and I think this is my hypothesis, when they get to the Bay Area, they become more productive. Something about being in the Bay Area transforms their work performance and gives them different opportunities. Right? Yeah.
Would you come to the same conclusion looking at, say, housing costs?
No, because as I mentioned, for housing costs, it's a minor part of the story. And in particular, this is it's a wonky point, but it's very important. You know, you'll read newspaper after newspaper, which will tell you average housing cost in the Bay Area is this, average housing cost in LA is that. Those are wild exaggerations of real housing cost differences, because the only way you can know housing costs is by breaking it down by population segment and seeing how people actually consume housing. And there are differences. 10, 12% difference maximum between the two regions. But you can't get anything like these kinds of wage differences as a pass-through. Okay, here's a summary way to do this. So in labor economics today, what we do is we try to think about two kinds of work in the economy. One form of work is what you might call routine work. That is work where most you perform according to rules. The skill levels associated with doing routine work are relatively low. When non-routine work, though, is the work that depends a lot on judgment and discretion of the individual to be productive and to do work the right way. And the other component of doing work that is highly rewarded in today's economy is what you might call work that mobilizes cognitive skills. And some manual skills are rewarded, but mostly manual skills are more and more embodied in machines than people today. And the cognitive skills haven't yet been embodied in machines, but that's coming. AI is coming to take your cognitive skills away. But we'll talk about that in 5 years. So these are sort of indicators, and the absolute value is less important than seeing them relative. So in 1970, both of our cities are above the national average, meaning that California as a whole is an economy with people doing more non-routine and more cognitive work than the country as a whole. That's why those initial figures show two highly performing cities. But they reverse fates. What happens is that San Francisco leaps way ahead of the country, and LA falls behind it. Okay, so it's all converging on the same story here. Now, again, what made these different pathways come about? If you were to put yourself back in 1970, all right, so this is, the hard part is put yourself in the position, Silicon Valley is about to be born, the digital revolution is about to be born, the financial revolution, the global revolution, a whole sort of change in the way we govern economies, the way we live. What would you have said about where the new dynamic places are going to be? And actually, you might have actually guessed LA. And the reason was because for the first 7 decades of the 20th century, LA was basically the focus of technology-based capitalism in America, all right? Because it captured the technology-based industries of the day. It also had a very kind of aggressive form of corporate development, and it did very well. It went from being small place with relatively modest incomes. It multiplied its population 21 times over, and as you saw at the beginning of my story, became the 4th richest city in America. It had more engineers, it had a vibrant entrepreneurial culture, it had more tech firms, equal education levels, and better infrastructure than the Bay Area. So how did this happen if we can't see it from that? Well, it didn't happen because somehow the Bay Area got more college graduates, because college graduates make more money in the Bay Area. So LA has a lot of college graduates, it's just that they don't get as well paid. It's not because of immigrants, or at least in this stylized fact here, because actually the Bay Area has a lot of immigrants too, as you know. By the way, both metropolitan areas have about almost identical proportions of foreign-born, 38, 39%. Slightly different composition. But any kind of immigrant, that immigrant will do better. So if you're a college graduate non-native, meaning highly schooled immigrant, you do better in the Bay Area. If you are a kind of, metaphorically speaking, less skilled immigrant, right? So on average, Latino population has slightly lower education levels than the population as a whole, but Latinos do better in the Bay Area than LA. Okay, so any way you cut this, there's something about the opportunity structure in the Bay Area compared to LA, or that's kind of the analysis we came up. So what happened? Well, there was aerospace, I'm not going to tell you too much, but really where we centered was, we started to look at the economics, and we thought, really, there's something going on here in the ways that the firms and people of these two regions responded to the challenges of new technologies and structural changes in the economy as a whole. So we started to look at these core sectors, aerospace, information technology, entertainment, finance, logistics, biotech. And what we found was that there were strongly diverging ways that firms, business leaders, leadership groups, and public agencies used their initial factor endowments. What I mean by that is the way they used their people and the knowledge that was in the regions, how do they put them together to be more or less successful? Let me give you some details on that. So first of all is that there's different leadership in the two regions. Right? We're going to build some layers into this one. One is leadership. It's a really striking, we looked at the main private sector, meaning business elite leadership organizations in the two regions. So in the Bay Area, that's called the Bay Area Council. And the Bay Area Council is very striking that as early as the early 1980s, it's putting out reports that are saying things like, we used to have a lot of manufacturing. It's almost inevitable that we'll lose a lot of it. You can be in agreement or not with that, but that's what they're saying. And mostly, we're the region of the future. We're going to be global, we're going to be high-waged, and we're going to be skill-based. And it was very focused on the cost issues. It's a lot of worrisome. They were worrisome then, they're still worrisome. But basically, the Bay Area Council, they elaborate what I would call a high road vision. Now, what happens in LA is very different. When you look at the LA Business Roundtable, the Chamber of Commerce, and a host of other ones, and what we did is we looked literally at what they said. We took their reports and we analyzed how they were seeing the situation and the kinds of strategies they were recommending. They basically were backward looking. At the same time that the Bay Area Council is saying, look to the future, high wage, high tech, high road. In LA, they're saying, you know, there was a golden age. And the golden age was in the 1950s and 1960s when we had cheap land, cheap labor, a lot of low regulation, low environmental controls. Let's go back to that and we'll have another business boom, right? They basically don't talk about technology or globalization at all. They don't talk about skilling, none of those issues. So basically they emphasize trying to rebuild old Southern California as a mid-century manufacturing metropolitan area. That, of course, by the way, was becoming less and less feasible, because already by that time, we were having massive waves of southern industrialization. The South had become much cheaper than California. California had become, especially coastal California, basically uncompetitive. And of course, the beginnings of an even further iteration of that, meaning globalization, was going on. So these leaders are saying, bring manufacturing back here, but manufacturing is saying, no, we're actually going to Texas and Georgia, and then we'll go to Mexico. Now, there's another aspect of leadership that's really striking. So one is the actual vision. What are they saying? But it's also the means by which they use to get this vision out. So you've got these two different visions, but they have very different networks for communicating them through the leadership structure. So what we did is we measured the network connections among the, basically the boards of directors of the major firms in the two regions. Just eyeball the next slide. Okay, that's San Francisco's leadership networks in 2010. That's LA's. Notice the difference? Right. So basically, what happens is that LA has divided and fragmented networks that don't talk to one another. The Bay Area, mostly through the efforts of a few key corporations aided by the Bay Area Council, has almost one big network where if you have an idea, everyone will get it. All right, well, that's just another iteration of that. The Bay Area Council has 3 times more connections to its economy than the leading one in LA. And after that, the LA is basically non-existent leadership. Okay, but there's other things that are going on that are about other kinds of networks. So Steve Casper at Claremont, he did a lot of work on measuring entrepreneurial networks, meaning what kinds of connections do people build up with each other through experiences in the economy? And what he came up with is a really striking number, which is the probability that someone in tech in the Bay Area will know someone who has started a firm in the region or where they've worked together as a manager or science is about 7 times higher in the Bay Area than LA. All right, that's the serial entrepreneurship phenomenon. All right, might not have been an original cause, but once this got going, it probably created an increasing advantage for the Bay Area, because once people know that there are networks in a place, they stay there, or the ambitious ones go there because they know that that's where they're going to plug into networks, right? Now here's where we get to the university story. So, you know, there are important scholars who have done work on universities' relationship to regional economies. There's a few of them there. Casper, again, he did some very interesting work on inventor networks in LA in relationship to the university structure there. So look at this here. Let's look at biotech patents at early on in our period. Basically, so LA has 6, the Bay Area has 9. But look at the divergence between 1980 and 2005. There are 801 patents in LA at the end of this period, and 1,550 in the Bay Area. So the Bay Area is accelerating a gap to LA. Spin-offs, the same thing, right? LA has less than half the spin-offs, and LA has a quarter of the individual inventors, as in the Bay Area. And again, there was a network analysis that was done trying to establish who knows who and how many connections it takes to get to another person. And in the central node, where people are connected by no more than 2 steps, okay? There are only 122 people in LA's central network by 2005. There's 2,400 in the Bay Area, okay? So bigger, stronger, denser networks of business elites, but now bigger, stronger, denser networks of inventors. But the role of universities seems to be critical to this, okay? LA universities have only 5 scientists in that central node of the network with those 112 people that I showed you a minute ago. San Francisco has 200 university-based scientists in its central node, all right? So the academic inventors in the main network of the Bay Area's biotech network are 29% of the total, and they're 1% in LA. So my people in the university, we're not connected, all right? And this mirrors the image of our leadership networks. My colleagues Lynn Zucker and Michael Darby showed in a classic paper in the field that in the new economy, that what they call star scientists, people who are university-based, but who have a high level of academic achievement and who then go on to start firms, right? That they innovate paradoxically close to home, even though they probably have global connections, any star scientist will, but they're more and more concentrated in a smaller number of metropolitan regions, suggesting once again that the star scientists who are going to be entrepreneurial are probably going to gravitate to the kinds of universities that have the broader networks where they can be more effective not only as scientists, but simultaneously as entrepreneurs. The biotech story is, I'm going to end on, the biotech story is almost a classic of sort of LA's differences to the Bay Area. It's sort of a little anecdote we can tell to sort of end this. The science is developed almost simultaneously in both LA and the Bay Area, right? It's Cohen and Boyer in UCSF, and Riggs and Itakurea in the City of Hope Hospital in Duarte, which is a suburb of LA. Actually, Boyer attempts his first startups in LA, and among these startups is Amgen. So he starts up Amgen, and the board was shared out between scientists who were based at 3 LA universities. You'd think, perfect case, right? They did exactly the right thing. Caltech, UCLA, and UCSD. And they have some major breakthroughs, which make them the first big successful biotech firm, and that's in greater LA, okay? Now, I should point out that Amgen is located in Thousand Oaks, which is in the West San Fernando Valley, and the theory was it'll be equidistant to UCLA, UCSB, and Caltech. Kind of interesting if you think about how we would do things. But very soon after being established, the scientists are kicked off of Amgen's management, and they have an IPO, so you'd say, great, they're becoming a big, successful early corporation. And, however, it becomes an old economy type firm. The scientists become workers, and what happens is that Boyer says, that's not what I wanted to do. I wanted to do something new. I wanted to do something inventive and creative, and this is now just another big corporation. So he teams up with this young entrepreneur from the IT world, because they're networked. And he creates a new form of firm called Genentech, all right? The Genentech model is totally different from the Amgen model, meaning that what Boyer says is to the scientists, do whatever you want, just keep being creative. I'm not going to tell you what to do research in. You can stay in this firm, and we're going to become a new kind of science-based capitalism. And of course, what happens is, and he doesn't restrict them from doing startups and spin-offs. The result, of course, is the spin-off phenomenon starts imitating what had already happened in IT earlier on, and moreover, they start to draw in some of the support structure that had already been developed in the IT world, venture capitalists, coaches, the whole story for sort of bringing these new kind of firms together. So the Bay Area never got a big hit like Amgen. But what it did get is many biotech firms. And the result, of course, is that the Bay Area cluster is many, many times bigger than that of LA today. LA has one big isolated, old-fashioned firm, I'll call it that, it's a little bit critical. And the Bay Area has a vibrant, expanding cluster. So, all right, hard to tell what's going to happen when you're looking forward in time. But I think that the sort of the moral of the story I'm telling here is that when you have forward movement of an economy, innovation is about uncertainty and change. It's about taking old resources, recombining them into new organizational forms, permitting the visioning of new kinds of markets and new kinds of practices with respect to R&D as well as production. And so what's going to maximize the possibility that that will happen? I think the moral of this story is something like deep and wide networks, and of many kinds of networks. Leadership, university, entrepreneurial, and community networks. They maximize the probabilities of getting the conversation going, meaning creating a buzz around what's new and how to do it. Providing the people who are possibly going into these activities a lower cost and more quick process of matching to the people and resources that they need. and reducing the barriers from conservative, encrusted interests and old-fashioned firms and conservative leadership organizations. So it's not a replacement for the economic fundamentals. I want to be clear on that. You need all of the right combinations of factors, infrastructure, good governance, all of that stuff. But what makes the difference is the possibility of bringing and reconfiguring resources together in a forward-looking way. And I think that's kind of, and just sort of the conclusion there is, of course, that what we saw is that university-based networks are a key piece of the, we might say, the layer cake of different kinds of networks that are part of that broader paradigm. Thank you for listening. Do you have one of these?
So I'll trade you.
Oh, that's my phone. I don't want that. All right.
Thank you. Perfect. And just show me the correct button.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. I'm so delighted that Martin brought all of us together, because these stories about the three metropolitan cities in California are truly fascinating. And San Diego is a completely different story. But in terms of outcomes, when I first heard Michael present, and I'd read the book, but it didn't hit me, I realized that the median wages for engineers in San Diego are something like 30,000 more than in LA, although they're still about 18 or 20 behind the Bay Area. And I looked at the clusters of biotech companies, IT companies. It's phenomenal what's happened in San Diego. I have to tell you, I want to give you a little bit of history. I got my PhD in 1969, and my husband and I wanted to move back to California. And he took a job in public administration at San Diego State University, and I burst out crying. I said, there's no way we can go there. There's nothing in San Diego but a zoo and the Navy. And Martin grew up there, and he knows I'm right. So I think starting from the vantage point of 1970, Michael, is extremely meaningful. Because if you, I don't have data on San Diego in 1970, but what I can tell you is that it was and still and continues to be a significant center of military R&D and also bases. But what I came to learn about San Diego, what differentiated it, and then I'll go through my slides, and second time hearing your talk, it really hit home. The military in San Diego was significantly R&D focused, and I'm going to show you that in a minute. So the military actually established the platform from which many of our now commercially competitive sectors evolved. So I'm going to ask you to bear with me with a little bit of social history about the community of San Diego, which is 20 minutes from the Mexican border. It has mountains and deserts to the east, Mexico to the south, the Valley of Fleas, Camino de la Peces, in north of Oceanside. And military bases. So it was a very isolated community compared to Los Angeles or San Francisco. Its topography is today absolutely gorgeous, but in the last centuries, particularly in the 19th century, impossible. How do you build farms? How do you grow agriculture? It's all hills and canyons and very little water. No extractable natural resources, no major transportation links, and a very slow population growth. But there was a distinctive civic culture that is non-trivial as we think about the 21st century. It was a place where people who had asthma, tuberculosis, all kinds of health problems that had been exacerbated by the Industrial Revolution in those great cities like Cleveland and Detroit, which are on your list. Those middle-class folks who could get out of those cities migrated to places like Phoenix and San Diego and others to settle for health purposes. So lots of spas, hotels, so utopian communities. And interestingly enough, a culture that was sort of anti-industrial and pro-environment and pro-clean industry. And we have good letters and documents from the past to underscore that. So the natural advantages of place, which today are extraordinary in a knowledge economy, a temperate climate, health-giving, Pacific-facing harbor, and lots of public land. I met someone at lunch, we were talking about land use. It's hard to talk about California without talking about the Spanish-American War and the fact that half the state were old Mexican rancheros that cities chose to use in different ways. And it's an important part of San Diego's history because the city used these Pueblo lands that were confiscated from the Mexicans and then re-granted to the cities by the state for economic development purposes. And these early settlers who were educated, anti-industrial, Midwesterners, tinkerers, collectors, naturalists. San Diego had a zoo and a natural history museum before almost any city on the West Coast because it attracted people who loved the natural environment. And so you get a community that begins to say, how are we going to grow our regional economy? And what they focus on are opportunities that are coming from a larger national developments, and in particular, the dawn of the Pacific century with the 1898 war and the decision to begin to build naval facilities on the West Coast. So a town with, what, 30,000 people by the turn of the last century really organizes to compete with LA and San Francisco, who already have very well-developed harbors, populations 3, 4, 5 times the size, to attract the military, and particularly the Navy, to San Diego. And it's a town of boosters, and my friend Martin often accuses me of being perfect for San Diego because I'm a bit of a booster, because that's all they could do was sell, come to our town, we'll give you parties, we'll give you land, we'll do an exposition, we'll show off your technology. And in fact, it worked. And I think it's important for those of us, I'm not an historian, I wrote this book with an historian, to remember that before television and a lot of advertising, expositions were very, very important to the economic development of regions. World's fairs, you know, all over Europe and all over the United States. And so this history of expositions in San Diego, and particularly the celebration of the opening of the Panama Canal in 1915, were actually pivotal to changing the course of San Diego's history. In our book, we fast forward a bit and talk about how, as a result of the success of these expositions and the decision to locate the Pacific Fleet in San Diego, not LA, not San Francisco, you had the growth of what Luskin calls a Marshall metropolis, an incredible buildup of marine, naval, and aircraft carrier bases and training. And you also had the growth of communications, aerospace R&D, and manufacturing, and two other things after the First World War that were pivotal to San Diego's history. And SIO is Scripps Institution of Oceanography, which was owned and operated by the University of California as a field station. And something I didn't know before I began this work is that in the 1930s, Robert Gordon Sproul, then the president of the University of California system, decided to designate 2 2 parts of California to be home for what he called the UC Division of War Research. Berkeley, Livermore, and Scripps Institution of Oceanography. And I think we have the quote in the book, Martin. I found it in a speech. There is no greater purpose to which the University of California can dedicate itself than to make the world safe for democracy. So that national security spirit was in the University of California, not just in all those Republicans in San Diego. So we became, long before there was a University of California campus, the university's Division of War Research. And equally important was in the build-up towards World War II, FDR designated, I think it was 4 federal cities. And San Diego was one of them. What did it mean to be a federal city? Not only were they investing in military bases and in training and in manufacturing, housing, sewer systems, transportation systems, schools, to take care of all the people who worked in that industry. So San Diego benefited enormously from World War I and World War II, and you can see, I mean, we're just riddled with bases all over the place. And all of that was public land which we turned over to the military. Now, the reason I give you that sort of background and I sort of sum it up here is I do think contemporary capabilities are based on strategic decisions that are made at important historical moments in time, which Gladwell talks about as tipping points. Clearly, the Spanish-American War was important to us because it opened up this sense that we can get clean industry, people in white suits who salute. We won't have labor strife. We won't get tuberculosis. We won't have, smokestacks. And the opening of the Panama Canal finally positioned. That exposition attracted so many people in the first year that it remained open a second year. Over 1 million people from all over the United States traveled to San Diego to come to an exposition which was basically rifle ranges and Marines climbing up walls, but also food and music, and it was an amazing event. And the rapid location of military bases, and particularly the airplane testing, think Charles Lindbergh, and the development of communications technology. I'm not sure on my date, but I think it was 1917. The tallest radio tower in America was in San Diego because of communications. And I always say to Rotary groups, why are we surprised we're one of the centers of wireless industry? And a lot of the early pioneers in the wireless industry were working for the Navy in what was then called remote signal processing, issues around communication with airplanes, ships, submarines. And a lot of that technology came from there. And as I mentioned, the designation of San Diego as a federal city. Now, Dick Atkinson, who used to be president of our university and was a personal mentor to me, usually tells the story of the University of California in terms of Vannevar Bush, who was FDR's advisor on science and technology throughout World War II. And then, after the war, wrote a treatise called Science, the Next Frontier, or the Last Frontier, Science, the Next Frontier, in which he tried to convince the Senate and the House and the federal government that it was the investment in basic science that saved the world for democracy. Now, what's so interesting about networks and civic culture, in San Diego, because there'd been so much R&D related to the military, everybody in the community, including the mayor who owned a furniture store, understood that. So when John J. Hopkins, the head of General Dynamics, when Roger Revelle, then leading the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, the Division of War Research, went down to the city council and to the mayor and said, Well, our city could tank. 60% of our GDP is tied to military. But if we get into the basic research business, we will not tank. And so in the 50s, premier land in San Diego on the what's called the Torrey Pines Mesa, where actually the Farmers Golf Tournament is going on right now with Tiger Woods, which could have been zoned for hotels, for golf courses, for million-dollar homes, was zoned for light industry and R&D. And that was a decision by the city council which made a huge difference. And the idea was the infusion of new money that was going to go into basic research would be a source of new forms of economic development. Those of us who live in California say, oh, Mary, that's not so interesting. Try to talk about this in Nebraska or Virginia or Michigan. Nobody was thinking that way. What's good for General Motors, right, is what's good for America. But what you had in this city is the future is in science. And you had that long before you had a university there, which I think is very interesting. So what happens is the network in this tiny town, and we have all the names of the men, and they were from the Chamber of Commerce, they were real estate developers, they were logistics company guys, 3 times made presentations to the UC Board of Regents asking for a University of California campus. The chair of the Regents, Ed Pauley of Pauley Pavilion, said there was no need in San Diego for a campus. UCLA was just fine, thank you very much. And after 3 visits by annexing land and also securing $1 million gift, the Regents approved the establishment of UC San Diego. And I sort of chronicle this here. I don't have to go through all of the details. But I think what the Bay Area story and the San Diego story share is a future-looking civic leadership. That communities understand the future is tied not to rebuilding on the past, but to seizing the opportunities that particularly science and technology represent for the future. And in that, our story is very common. I want to tell you a little bit about the UC San Diego campus. Some of you may know this, but it's interesting that given this sort of culture of, aren't we wonderful, science saved the world for democracy, there was also this notion, nothing but the best. So UCSD did not open as an undergraduate college. We hired full professors, and we infuriated the regents and the office of the president by doing this. The campus would bundle 2 assistant professors' salaries in order to hire a full professor. But what result, and they got all the support they needed from the defense contractors, because you wanted the best physicists, you wanted the best chemists, you wanted the best biologists. Now, if you're trying to recruit them from, not Stanford at that time, but from Princeton and other great universities around the country, it wasn't easy. And what Roger Revelle did, he only had Quonset huts on a former military base. And he told these scientists, you know, Princeton won't let you do what you really want to do. You come out to San Diego, you can do anything you want. We got tons of money, we'll build the lab you want. And one of those chemists who I interviewed made the comment, we only wanted scientists who were full of piss and vinegar. If they fit in at a traditional university, they weren't going to be any good for UCSD. So what I'm trying to share with you is that the campus was developed around a culture of challenge the status quo. Give up your wonderful lab, your prestigious institution, come work in a Quonset hut and build something bigger and better. So guess what happens? Your first faculty hires are Nobel laureates, they're Academy of Science members, and I have to say for all the women in the room, a half a dozen of them were married to women with PhDs who had only worked in laboratories at places like Princeton and MIT, and they got professorships at UC San Diego. One of them was Helen Mayer, and I always love to tell this story, who 3 years after they moved to La Jolla got the Nobel Prize. The local newspaper reported, La Jolla housewife wins Nobel Prize. So very, very interesting. But what I'm trying to give you a sense of is that a small town that was in no way competitive with LA or San Francisco had to do things in very different ways. What's happened today, many of you know, the campus opened in 1960, it was admitted to AAU in 1982. Phenomenal achievement, but that's partly because all those full professors brought their grants, their postdocs, and everything with them. This year, we ranked number 5 with $1.6 billion in research funding. UCSD was, I put a few of the rankings, and I wanted you to all see, we still are the top surf college, but we're doing extremely well in academic rankings, and UCSD is associated with startups, 4th in the nation, over 650 companies that are related to the campus in some way, more than 2,900 inventions. This is 1 year, guys. And our economic impact on the regional economy, we estimated about $1.5 billion. The story we tell is that the university and the city grew together, that was a synergistic process, and that the city was there advocating for and investing in a university before the regents would even approve it. And throughout the history of the campus, with a brief period with the anti-war movement in the 1960s and 70s, there's been a significant amount of private sector investment and support. The impact of research institutions. I wanted to share this with you because I work with this Connect group that Martin referenced. And we wanted to give citizens a sense of the impact of research on the community. And so we decided what the community really cares about, even though they support what we do, are convention centers, Comic-Con, aircraft carriers, and golf championships. So we did the numbers. I didn't do them, a smart young economist. The research community that is developed on this mesa around UCSD, which includes the Salk Institute, the Scripps Research Institution, the Craig Venter, the Center for Regenerative Medicine. There are dozens now of research institutions, all of whom, thank you very much, got their land from the city and then built, is the equivalent of 4 convention centers. I mean, that's incredible, because we're one of the biggest convention cities in America. The aircraft carriers are really important because one aircraft carrier means a lot to a city. My son, who is a frustrated scratch golfer, was impressed with the golf tournaments. In a city like San Diego, even though there's this appreciation of the military and its economic impacts, the ability to extrapolate on the value of research to the economy is not easy. And so that's why reports like this that are done by the university in partnership with the Economic Development Corporation, actually it's by my group at the university, mean a great deal to continuing civic support for the university. So just very quickly, and I won't go in detail about these maps, and you can have any of these slides, but we have very good begatting charts and developmental charts on clusters that have evolved in San Diego over the last 40 years. And of course, ICT, building on the wireless and communications industry, is significant. The defense cluster, I think last year the defense cluster and military bases represented about 24% of GDP, and research funding for all of these institutes represented about 25%, so we're still 49% dependent on federal funding. Sporting goods cluster. I'm probably the only one in the room who dated a boy who drove a real Woody, and he did. But I grew up with wooden surfboards, skis, tennis rackets, and station wagons. And everything's composite materials, and a lot of those materials have evolved right out of the military. The life sciences cluster, hitting way above LA. In fact, an organization founded in San Diego called Biocom is now working with the LA Economic Development Corporation to help grow the biotech cluster in the LA area. We separate biomedical products from pharmaceuticals. And clean tech, alternative energy, and General Atomics, which evolved out of General Dynamics, has been very pivotal to that. So we also do a second report, and again, I think it's important, Martin, that the university is a partner in generating these reports for the media and for the general public on impacts. And we talk about the innovation economy, and we do annual reports on the growth of companies, the growth of jobs. And you will see it shifts over time. This year, software is the big area of growth in San Diego. So I think that civic culture and social dynamics are important. I think that's core to what Michael's describing in terms of what differentiates Los Angeles and San Francisco. But civic culture plays out in different places. We were basically a small Midwestern town, a town full of boosters, but a town full of reasonably educated people who wanted clean industries and who understood, because they're small businessmen and well-networked, the importance of the military to the economy and how R&D was going to change that. So I describe it as a kind of risk-oriented culture and valuing and supporting R&D very, very early compared to other cities. But again, because of its value to the military initially, and now to the creation of new products and processes. The entrepreneurial talent piece is hugely important, and I think this has profound implications, Provost, for recruitment strategies at universities. Because universities that look at all the conventional markers when they attract faculty may risk getting people who just talk to the same people. And what the 60s allowed UCSD to do, which is maybe impossible to do today, in today's economy, was to take outrageous risks on the kind of people they hired. And another quote we have in our book, it was Clark Kerr who came to speak to about 20 of the founding faculty, who are all these full professors, about you can't just be a science place, you have to be a comprehensive university. But you can be a great university like Harvard if you really work at it. And one of the professors stood up and said, I didn't come here to be a professor at a place like Harvard. That's the past. We're the future. I mean, that kind of attitude, that takes a risk. And chancellors who are willing, and department chairs and deans who are willing to hire people like that. So that entrepreneurial talent isn't just in the community at large, it's in the research community. So the Jonas Salks, the Craig Ventners, try to get along with a guy like Jonas Salk. I knew all these guys. Or to be in a room with Craig Venter, who fills it up with how important he is. But we manage it because guess what? It really generates a lot of value for the region. I think the third thing are these integrative civic platforms. I haven't talked about that at length today, but at least in San Diego, UCSD has been the convener of many of these integrative platforms, in part because universities can be honest brokers. And so the Connect program, another program that related to cross-border economic growth and synergies, were all championed by the Chancellor, administered by people like me, and created conversations and shared a shared sense of promise for the future, multiple gateways, a culture of reinvestment, time and money. You mentioned people stay. And one of the more interesting things about San Diego is the quality of life is such that many, many entrepreneurs who exit their companies just take the money and reinvest in new companies. So an abundance of serial entrepreneurs. The Bay Area benefits from that too, I think, enormously. So Martin asked, what do you see as the path forward? And I think what is so exciting about our region, though it's on a smaller scale than the Silicon Valley, is its diversity. That's why I wanted you to see those maps. When, it's not Novo Nordisk. I'm trying to, big pharmaceutical company, I'm having a senior moment. When they moved to town, we hosted the Connect program, a lunch, and asked, why did you choose to locate a major research facility here? Thinking, of course, they would say, fantastic biology. And the response was, oh, you have a great supercomputer center. But you're a pharmaceutical company. This is 20 plus years ago. And the CEO of the division said, yes, but the future of life sciences is computational biology, right? And high-speed computing. There are very few communities that are good in life sciences and high-speed computing. I think that's an advantage of the Silicon Valley. I think it's an advantage of Seattle. I think it's an advantage of San Diego. And it's why the rich are continuing to get richer. Because communities that have multiple centers of research and commercialization competence are poised to build these interdisciplinary and integrative, cross-disciplinary capabilities, so that health IT, precision medicine, personalized medicine, these things become very important. And so I've shared with you some of the things. My friend who worked in pond scum and is now a hero because it's known as biofuels, and data mining for finance, health, composite materials, drones and robots for agriculture, aging. I mean, UC system as a whole is very good, but if you look across the state, there are not that many places where you have the aggregation of so much diversity and so much capacity. And finally, there's a region-wide and interinstitutional focus on inclusive education and talent development. What is so interesting to me in San Diego, coming from the tradition I come from, is the extent to which industry understands that if the University of California cannot be open to the full diversity of talent that's coming from the multiple first-generation communities that live in our cities, we as an economy are not going to succeed. The Chancellor has had extraordinary, in the hundreds of millions, success in raising funds for scholarships and in growing pre-college pipeline programs. And again, it's all tied to this appreciation of talent and excellence that goes way back 100 years. So we've evolved over a 150-year period into an innovation hub. We're always going to be a second or third tier. We're not Silicon Valley. We're not Boston. But there continues to be a lot of energy in the region. And I think it is in part based on this long history of appreciating the value of R&D to the economy. Thank you. Oh, and Michael got to show you his book. That's mine. Okay, Martin, it's yours.
Sit there and
Okay.
we can entertain questions from the audience. They will take care of it. We'll start with Catherine and Dave.
What a wonderful presentation. Piggybacking on Mary's ending with the importance of diversity to growing an economy, I wonder, Michael, if you had looked at the spatiality of the networks in Los Angeles as an explanatory factor, just considering the long history of redlining, spatial discrimination and the transit deserts that choked large communities in terms of being able to even reach jobs as a potential explanation for why LA's economy has lagged the last 30 years.
Well, I mean, the networks that we were looking into really, aren't about residential patterns, which is, I think, what you're referring to, or even commuting patterns. They're organizational networks that have to do with who knows who and whether they work together. Now, you're suggesting that maybe behind the backs of that could be certain forms of basically geographical segmentation. And I think there's two things that we came across that go in that direction. So one of them is that, and this is a contrast between the two regions. So both LA and San Francisco, you could consider them, quote unquote, the old urban cores. And each of them has a new high-tech region that develops at its southern end. One is called Orange County, and the other is called Silicon Valley. So now, these places arise mostly from their own endogenous development. And organization, not only spatially, but organizationally, they arise often on the basis of new industries with different entrepreneurs and new leaders. So one question you could ask against that geographical background is, do they become organizationally or reintegrated to become a functioning regional leadership structure and regional economy? Answer in the Bay Area is yes. Answer in LA is no. And that was a very striking finding that we had. So the network slide, I mean, there's a lot more detailed data. The bottom line is Orange County doesn't relate to LA and doesn't want to. I mean, business leadership, they were right out front saying, LA is what they called the big dog on the block. If we get close to them, they'll eat us. When we went to Silicon Valley, the interviews were striking, and they were confirmed by the hard data, which is that, once again, the Bay Area Council especially, but a few other organizations, they early on saw that San Francisco was becoming the minor player in the Bay Area economy, and that Silicon Valley was becoming the new center. And they made huge efforts to integrate the Silicon Valley leadership into the Bay Area leadership. And there's a lot of stories about how that happened, but the point is it happened. So space isn't deterministic, but it's a background. There's another thing, though, that the Bay Area is paradoxical with respect to its space. So think about it this way. It's about natural geography relating to political and social geography. So the Bay Area is actually a very fragmented region because it has a bay, right? It's a region that's this big obstacle in the middle of it. LA's one big plain crisscrossed by freeways that's a kind of like formless blob, right? Now, the paradox is, what we discovered, because we did some history on it, in big complex regions, it's very hard to bring about sustained political and policy cooperation. Every county, every city, every interest group has a different agenda. That's a natural part of a big complex region. So, however, in our two regions, the capacities for overcoming that natural fragmentation and rivalry are very different. It looks to us like what happened was that actually the Bay turned out to be a critical obstacle that had to be overcome that generated social learning. By which I mean, if County A and County B need a bridge, right, they've actually got to negotiate with one another to build it, right? If you have one big county with one board of supervisors, it does whatever it wants, which is what LA has always done. So the paradox is the more fragmented region in political terms. The Bay Area has 10 counties, it has a bay. Very early on, they had to learn how to literally interconnect one region around a barrier. And they built up an organizational capacity for all of these fragmented governments actually negotiating with one another. In LA, the power of LA City and LA County enabled them to run around cooperation, just to basically to crush all the small players. So when Orange County came along, they said, that's the story, we'll never talk to those people. Okay, second point about geography is another one that, again, I can't prove in sort of quant terms, but it came out in several histories that are written and several interviews. So the tech part of LA County, sort of spatially, is the area running along the coast south of LA Airport. That's called the South Bay. That's where and it's a big technology belt that goes now all the way into Orange County. Okay, so that's a world, you might say, of tech, executives, companies, communities. You know, people going to cocktail parties, you know, everyone saw Mad Men, you know what it's like, right? So the other big leadership communities in LA are Hollywood. Hollywood is physically in Hollywood and residentially in the southern San Fernando Valley and the west side. And finance, and we might call old LA, which is downtown LA up to Pasadena and San Marino. So these three communities are sociologically distinct. There are, to put it bluntly, there's the Jews versus everyone else, the Jews excluded by everyone else for a long time. That's Hollywood and Beverly Hills and the West Side. And rivalrous communities actually between old Pasadena and San Marino and tech engineers. So now translate this into, I have a couple of urban sociology colleagues who've been working on these issues, and they said to me, you're absolutely right. The bottom line is, when push comes to shove, these people didn't go to the same golf courses, their kids didn't go to the same schools, they didn't go to the same social clubs, they had different social and political tastes, so that when time comes around in crisis, for them to know each other in ways that they could solve problems, they didn't know each other, talk to each other, or have much an idea about each other at all. And that, of course, is where the unified, clubby, old San Francisco elite comes in. Small, relatively small city, relatively cohesive elite that just simply had better sort of discussion possibilities. Now, we haven't gone down, you know, to other levels of sort of communities on the ground, but there it's the same thing. San Francisco Federation of Labor, much more inclusive and regionally powerful than the LA Fed. You could sort of go on, you know, into community mobilization, but I think the bottom line is these kind of fragmentations end up mattering for how they contribute to or block networks.
See, and I think if you were to, I mean, you basically described San Diego.
Yeah, yours is an inclusive
Because it's a completely inclusive. So you had John J. Hopkins, the head of General Dynamics, Roger Revelle, the head of Scripps Institution of Oceanography, in meetings with furniture store owners and used car and bankers, having to work together because they were worried about the economy to get a University of California campus. So sometimes the small and fragmented necessitates a kind of cooperation and very, very interesting. David.
So I wanted to pull on the Defense Department threads in the two accounts and see if I can make some sense here. So, Michael, you made the point that LA lost defense to other parts of the country. Part of that story was the Defense Department found that it was in their interest to spread out the wealth so that politically nobody wanted to cut the defense budget because they had a piece of it in their local district. But that was the old, it was kind of old economy manufacturing that they did that with. In your story, the R&D part, it's harder to do that with for all the reasons that you're talking about here.
On my list, you'll see I talked about the various research labs that were established as naval laboratories on Point Loma. Those are still very, very active research labs. Many of our faculty do classified research there even today. And the defense contracting companies, in fact, benefit, we're forging new technologies, right? I mean, and so this R&D focus that was built into having the Navy and aerospace. But you had aerospace too, but it was mostly manufacturing, yeah. And so I think it's a subtle but an important difference. And I think actually Scripps being the Division of War Research was non-trivial in San Diego because it incentivized the working scientists to interact with the military. And in our book, we point out that Roger Revelle was a naval officer who ran Scripps. He was in the Bohemian Club. Until he died, he went to the Grove every summer. I hear about it. And he was, do you see what I mean? He was the bridge, but we also had elected officials that were very well positioned in Washington to do that kind of lobbying. But I do think it was that distinctive R&D heritage that helped us.
You're making me think there's one sort of level to this issue of sort of like university community, but also inter-university or inter-R&D institution network. So one thing that we discovered in our research, I didn't talk about it in my presentation, is I believe that one of the key, maybe lucky strokes for the Bay Area in the early development of IT was Xerox PARC, the Xerox Palo Alto Research Center. So why, Xerox was, a photo optics company. It comes out, it sets up this research center, and it basically says to the scientists, do whatever you want. But the core thing is, so Paul Duguid, who was there, told us that he said, so Xerox PARC was the meeting point, the place where Berkeley met Stanford in the early days. And these were very different, the feelings of these communities were very different in those days, wild kind of Berkeley people and more kind of buttoned down Stanford people. But the point is that it built up social networks among them that seemed to have long-term spillover effects. And you contrast that with the stories that people tell, so about Caltech especially. Yeah. So, Caltech has 33 of the Nobel Prizes out of 40 that are held by Californians today. That's how prestigious it is. But it's an ivory tower. I'm not saying that as a criticism, but it's explicitly set up, or at least until recently, there was a certain rejection of being kind of hands-on, okay? A cultural rejection of it. And oddly enough, that's the story we got about UCLA. UCLA was sort of, we have to be Berkeley. Berkeley is the California Public Ivy League. How can we be more like Berkeley? To do that, we have to be pure, right? We don't want to be too involved. We have to be prestigious. And so Berkeley was sort of, had less hang-ups about that. So I don't know, it's hard to bring all this stuff together into a hard analysis that you can prove, but the stories do add up about different kinds of network connections between the R&D institutions and also how they relate to the wider regional community.
And it's interesting because that's echoed in UCSD's experience. People who started UCSD were not interested in building companies and the economy, but to a man, and they were men, they had worked at JPL, Fermilab, Princeton. They'd all been involved in the war effort, those early founding professors. So the utility of science, right, to solve problems, in this case, related to national security, I think echoes a little bit of what you were saying.
Oh, unfortunately, we're running this last question there and short answers because we're running a little late and we'll have our reception.
So Sacramento has been trying to do economic development around innovation for a while, and there's been different dynamics with that. But I'm curious if either of you, and probably especially Professor Storper, if you've encountered anything in terms of our relation to the Bay Area, because there's been a push-pull where we've been trying to pull funding and networks up to Sacramento, and there's conventional wisdom that our innovation gets sucked down there. And I'm wondering if you encountered any research about the relationship between San Francisco and Sacramento.
Okay, well, we came across one thing that's very consistent story that came out by our interviewees in both regions is respect to the strength, the network connections of these two regions to Sacramento, which is, to put it bluntly, the Bay Area people told us straight out. They said, oh, you know, the great thing is we have a lock on everything that's statewide important because we're close to Sacramento and we have older networks that are stronger, and LA is behind us. So LA's political fragmentation and distance were regularly cited by the Bay Area people as a strength of the Bay Area and by the LA people as a weakness. Now, that's not an answer to your question. It's more about the sort of political relationships. I think one thing, though, to sort of add to that is just that R&D has very, very strong agglomeration forces today. Right? So, and any kind of development project that seeks to spread innovation out is kind of, it's running against the market forces today. And it's not only Sacramento, it's the entire country, right? You can see now, a spatial concentration of innovation that's going on all over the world in major metropolitan areas, and basically a strong, what's called a strong distance decay, and limited diffusion of technological spillovers. So that's kind of just the sort of the basics of it that are the reality test for any non-metro, I mean, Sacramento is a metropolitan place, but non-big metropolitan place that's seeking a break-in. A break-in. I don't have an answer.
But it suggests an image. I remember when Thomas Friedman's book came out, The World is Flat,
Yeah.
and Rich Florida did a piece in the Atlantic, The World is Spiked.
Yeah.
Because when you measure R&D and patents, and he had a map of the world, and that's happening in what, 15, 20 places in the world. Manufacturing may be flat, right? Markets may be flat, but innovation spikes.